Hello. Now I need to get used to this microphone. It's not good here? Or is it okay? Do you want to turn it down a bit? Hello, 1, 2, 3. That sounds better. Is that okay? Am I audible? Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Thank you to Howard and the team at Sumiruna for organising this great event. I woke up this morning to the news that Britain is leaving the European community. I will make a comment about that at the appropriate point in my talk. So the theme is psychedelics and civilization and the war on consciousness. This is, of course, the attitude in our society today. And I would like to make clear, I do believe that psychedelics are a very serious matter. I don't think in our society, the way that it's structured, that they're appropriate for children. I think this is an adult experience in our society. I do believe that if all so-called drugs were legalized, we would be able to have a much more rational way of working with them than presently prevails under that evil and wicked enterprise known as the war on drugs. Nevertheless, psychedelics are, in my opinion, for adults. I'm showing this slide simply to give the modern view. It's interesting if you go back into antiquity. Here's a schoolroom actually from ancient Egypt, and it's not that old. It's about 300 AD, about 1,700 years old. And written on the walls of this schoolroom are positive references to drugs. We have Greek writings on its walls which give us the story from the Odyssey about the Trojan War. Helen of Troy gives her guests a drug, most likely opium, that takes away grief and anger and brings forgetfulness of every ill. Whoever should drink this down when it is mixed in a bowl would not let fall a tear down his cheek in the course of that day, at least. I can't imagine this being written on the wall of any school in Europe today. And it suggests perhaps that attitudes have changed over time towards the substances that we refer to as drugs. From ancient Crete, a poppy goddess. That's of course the opium poppy, 1250 to 1300 BC, and here we have a signet ring from Knossos, 1500 BC. Demeter is handing 3 poppy heads to Persephone. So clearly no negative views about opium at that time. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the great poem Kublai Khan. I wonder if I can remember a little of it. In Xanadu did Kublai Khan a stately pleasure-dome decree, where Alf, the sacred river, ran through caverns, measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. This majestic piece of poetry was written under the influence of opium. And famously, there came a knock on the door as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, in his opium trance, was writing the poem. It was the postman bringing a package. He received the package. By the time he returned to his desk, he'd completely forgotten the rest of the poem. But it seems that some good things do come out of these demonized substances. Ancient Egypt, I don't like the title of William Mebenham's book, Narcotic Plants, because it deals with so much more, and the word narcotic is very loaded in our society. But if we just look at some of these images, we can see here Nefertiti presenting opium poppy heads to her husband Akhenaten. I certainly cannot imagine Queen Elizabeth of Britain presenting opium poppy heads to Prince Philip. And then, of course, here, interestingly, we have rays of the datura flower, the highly visionary datura flower, descending into the third eye of the initiate. And then what are all those images of water lilies in ancient Egypt, where you see them sniffing the aroma of the water lily? It's so much more than that. It's a prevalent motif in ancient Egyptian sacred art, and properly used, it is a mild visionary aid. And we know that they knew how to use it properly, because traces of a liquid extract from the blue water lily were discovered in alabaster jars stored in Tutankhamun's tomb. Behind me, this is from the walls of the Temple of Karnak in Upper Egypt. And here we see the god Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom, writing the name of the pharaoh Seti I on the Tree of Life. Now, my friend Dennis McKenna, who's sitting over there, an ethnopharmacologist, who knows so much more about these things than I do, has identified this tree as the Tree of Life, as Acacia nilotica. And Acacia nilotica contains dimethyltryptamine, the most powerful hallucinogen known to man. It's a little bit of a chemical operation to get the DMT out of the bark of the tree into a form where it's smokable. But, and many have argued that the ancient Egyptians would not have had the chemical knowledge to undertake such an operation. But we need to ask ourselves, where do we get the word chemistry from? Well, it comes from the ancient name of Egypt, which was Kemet. From that, we get the words alchemy and chemistry. So, I think the ancient Egyptians were quite up to the task of extracting DMT from Acacia nilotica. And perhaps we can say that we know what the ancient Egyptians were smoking. Tutankhamun's tomb. Notice the stars and the rays descending from the stars. This is the second shrine of Tutankhamun. Some suggestion into the third eye of the initiate descends influences from above. As above, so below. There's deep meaning in reliefs of this sort. And just an interesting meme that's around on the internet, comparing the pineal gland, the third eye, to the eye of Horus, and the general suggestion that the ancient Egyptians were very well aware of these connections. There is an argument that the dimethyltryptamine, which exists in all human bodies, is produced in or associated with the pineal gland. More research needs to be done, but it's an interesting connection. This is Tiwanaku in Bolivia, 14,000 feet above sea level, where we see the Acapana Pyramid and the Kawasa Sia. And within the Kawasa Sia were found a number of statues. Here's a couple of them. And of course the ancient aliens lobby love to say that these are ray guns of alien visitors. I beg to differ. What they are is much more interesting than that. What they are snuff trays for the consumption of an Adenanthera DMT-laden snuffs. This immediately gives us much more enlightenment about the ancient civilization of Tiwanaku than any notion of aliens coming here in high-tech spaceships. Dr. Manuel Torres has made this identification. Caral. It used to be argued that there were no pyramids in the New World as old as the pyramids of Egypt, for example. But that view has had to be revised since the excavation of Caral over the last 15 years or so. Corral is a gigantic pyramid site, some 60 miles north of Lima, and it's at least as old as the majority of works at Giza in Egypt, going back to 3000 BC or thereabouts. And interestingly, it was a large urban centre. The view of archaeologists used to be that such urban centres could only be created with warfare, that they would be driven and motivated by the desire to make war on others or to defend themselves from others. This turns out not to be the case at Corral. As a matter of fact, there's no evidence of war whatsoever, rather of happy coexistence with neighbouring peoples. And interestingly, amongst their prominent imports were hallucinogenic snuffs from the Amazon. So the ideology in our society that says that you can't build or do anything great under the influence of psychedelics is clearly wrong. And it may be that our society is radically out of step with the rest of the human story. I mean, we're so proud of modern Western technological society, but really it's like a little pimple on the forehead of the story of human civilization. And we should not imagine that the conclusions we come to have any special virtue or validity. So here is Francisco de Orellana, who now finds himself on stamps. Back in 1541, he was one of the conquistadors. He went hunting one day on the Amazon in a longboat with about 20 of his companions. They fully expected to be back by the evening, but the Amazon disagreed. And they were carried 4,000 miles all the way to the Atlantic outlet of the Amazon. And on that 4,000-mile journey, Orellana reported seeing many great cities along the course of the Amazon River in the middle of this supposedly pristine rainforest, which turns out to be something much more complicated than that. And in subsequent generations, it was held that Orellana had made the whole story up. Of course, there could be no cities in the Amazon, which was supposedly inhabited only by hunter-gatherers. But it turns out Orellana's observations were correct, and the tragic clearances of the Amazon that are taking place today have revealed this. We are finding the remains of the great cities that lay along the banks of the Amazon. Those cities rapidly became depopulated. Why? Because of smallpox brought by the European conquerors. But before that time, there was a flourishing urban civilization in the Amazon, found a way to coexist with urban life and the Amazon rainforest, a great innovation in human culture. And then we have the mystery of terra preta. Some research into terra preta, this man-made soil of the Amazon, this self-replicating, self-fertilizing soil, take its origins back more than 11,000 years. Some human communities created this soil, and it's still fertile today. Rainforest soils are not normally particularly fertile for agriculture. That's one of the reasons why it's just an incredibly stupid idea to cut down the rainforest and plant soybean farms. But there are patches of fertility within the Amazon, and these go back to the ancient human inhabitants who found a way to create this almost magic. And again, the clearances are revealing a hidden story in the Amazon. Huge earthworks are emerging from the jungle, and even megalithic stone circles. Clearly the story of the Amazon still largely remains to be told. I think of it like other ecosystems in the world today, like for example the Sahara Desert or the world's oceans. These are places that hide the story of the human past. And we should not imagine that we have the whole story of the human past, while places like the Amazon and the Sahara Desert and the world's oceans remain largely unexplored by archaeology. Sea level rose by 120 meters at the end of the last ice age, submerging 27 million square kilometers of land that was above water during the ice age and is underwater today. Well, the Amazon is an incredible home of biodiversity. One estimate puts it at more than 150,000 different species of plants and trees. It's surely a work of remarkable ethnopharmacology that we have the mystery and the magic of ayahuasca. I'm here in front of one of the two ingredients of the ayahuasca brew. This is Psychotria viridis, known as chacruna in the Amazon, and it contains dimethyltryptamine, DMT. However, as I'm sure many of you are aware, dimethyltryptamine is not normally orally active. We have an enzyme in our gut called monoamine oxidase, which switches off DMT on contact. So if you were to make a tea of hundreds of these leaves, you really could drink as much as you liked and it wouldn't have a psychedelic effect. What you need to make DMT orally active is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And it turns out that the ayahuasca vine, the other ingredient of the ayahuasca brew, always regarded as the intelligence behind the brew in the Amazon, that the ayahuasca vine, although not profoundly psychedelic itself, contains a monoamine oxidase inhibitor that allows the gut to absorb the DMT in the leaves when the two are cooked together, usually in a fairly simple and basic way. Break up lengths of the vine, add some hundreds of leaves, cook in a pot, boil down, and eventually you end up with this sometimes black and sometimes reddish brew, which I will be talking a bit more about a little later in this presentation. There is another way, another form of ayahuasca, usually referred to as yahe, where the DMT element is contained in the leaves of another vine, Dipropteris cabrerana. The ayahuasca vine remains a consistent part of the brew throughout all Amazonian traditions. Consider how you put together two plants out of 150,000 plants. How do you do that? Do you do that by trial and error? It's a scientific process, really. Or were you taught how to do it by the spirits, as is maintained in Amazonian tradition? Whatever the answer to that question, it's a remarkable feat to have discovered the process of activating the DMT in the leaves through the use of the ayahuasca vine. This is on the way to Chavin de Huantar in Peru. Drive, I don't know, about 200 miles north of Lima, turn right, head up into the Andes, go up to a great height, and you find yourself in this majesty, and then you descend into the valley of Chavin, where we have this comment from 1616. Near this town of Chavin lies a great edifice made of well-carved stones of notable grandeur. It was a huaca, and the shrine of the most famous of the pagans, as Rome or Jerusalem is, to make their offerings and sacrifices, because the devil in this place gave them many oracles, and thus they came from all over the kingdom. And the comment refers to great galleries and halls and chambers beneath the ground, and they wonder what those were for. Well, we know what they were for. These are the galleries and halls and chambers beneath Chavin, where you can occasionally encounter interesting therianthropic entities, part serpent, part human. They were creating a setting for psychedelic experience, a perfect setting for psychedelic experience in darkness, in these hallways beneath the ground. And we know what the psychedelic was. It was the San Pedro cactus, in which the active ingredient is mescaline, and you can see it in the imagery from Chavin itself here. So this whole place of pilgrimage was dedicated to the visionary experience, to the psychedelic experience, in a way that's almost unimaginable in modern society. We see the same veneration of psychedelics all across the ancient world. Peyote, also the active ingredient is mescaline, as it is in the San Pedro cactus. And a peyote bowl from Colima in western Mexico, deer with peyote button, Monte Alban and Hancock, so on and so forth. The Maya did incredible things with pyramids. They were an amazing, extraordinary culture. The Mayan calendar is one of the vast achievements of humanity with its precision. So clearly the fact that they made extensive use of psychedelics did not inhibit the greatness of their civilization. Rather, I would suggest it was a key factor in the greatness of that civilization. And we can see these Maya mushroom stones, Sarasai Mexicana, from Guatemala, 500 BC. The Olmecs were the predecessors of the Maya. This is Olmec art from La Venta in Mexico. If I were giving another talk, I'd have a lot more to say about this piece, but we must move on. The Olmecs also made use of psychedelics, particularly venerating the Amanita muscaria fly agaric mushroom. So we can see the Amanita muscaria mushroom transforming into the jaguar god here, and the that's there, and then an Olmec baby weird jaguar wearing an Amanita muscaria mushroom cap. Have we all heard of Soma, the visionary agent of ancient India, which modern India is currently determined to deny had anything to do with psychedelics? But the detailed research on this subject suggests very strongly that Soma was a liquid produced from the Amanita muscaria mushroom. It's an interesting thing about Amanita muscaria. It's actually quite difficult to get into a psychedelic state with that mushroom. But the way it works is this: if you're the shaman and you eat a lot of the mushrooms and then you piss in a bowl, and then you give that bowl to others to drink from, they will have a psychedelic experience. It's as though the human body acts as a filter, removing impurities from the mushroom and allowing the psychedelic effect to come through. It's the same if you drink reindeer urine, which contains Amanita muscaria. Actually, it's been discovered that you can pass Amanita muscaria through 7 human bodies before it loses its potency. So a line in the Vedas, the ancient Indian Vedas, which speaks of the priests drinking soma and then pissing soma, is actually very instructive. Because if we drink tea or beer, we piss urine. But Amanita muscaria passes through the urinary system and becomes, if anything, even more effective. Eleusis is a sad place today, just outside of Athens, ruined, but it was once a great center of pilgrimage across the ancient world. And there, as at Shavin, enormous underground galleries were created. This was called the Telestrion. And initiates came to Eleusis, and they were given a brew to drink, the Kaikion. They then entered the Telestrion, where they had life-changing experiences, on which many of them reported. Here's Pindar: "Happy is he who, having seen these rites, goes below the hollow earth, for he knows the end of life, and he knows its God-sent beginning." Plato was an initiate at Eleusis, so was Aristotle, so was Sophocles. Sophocles wrote, "Thrice happy are those mortals who, having seen these rites, depart for Hades. For them alone is granted to have a true life there." In other words, there's the suggestion that the experience undergone by the initiates at Eleusis abolished their fear of death, that they came to understand that death was not the end, but maybe just the beginning of the next great adventure. And thanks to the research by Gordon Wasson, Albert Hoffman, and Carl Ruck in this amazing book, The Road to Eleusis, we can now be pretty sure what the Kaikion beverage was. It consisted of barley and Claviceps paspali, which is a non-poisonous form of ergot containing LSD-like visionary alkaloids. In other words, basically they were taking LSD at Eleusis. It was the beating heart of the ancient Greek world. It was destroyed by Christian fanatics in the early centuries of the Christian era. Athens has given nothing to the world more excellent or divine than the Eleusinian mysteries, said Cicero. So we shouldn't be surprised to find the use of psychedelics at the heart of so many advanced ancient civilizations. Psychedelics actually appear to have played a key role in the emergence of modern human behavior. This is what I call 6 million years of boredom. This is the story of the progress of humanity from the last common ancestor with the chimpanzee around 6 million years ago through to anatomically modern humans and beyond. The earliest anatomically modern human skeleton so far found is about 200,000 years old. It doesn't mean we won't find older ones, but at the moment that seems to be when anatomically modern humans began to at least leave an impact in the fossil record. Most of the story is incredibly boring. I mean, they didn't invent stone tools until about 2.5 million years ago. There they are. Having invented them, they were so pleased with them that they stuck with them without any change for the next 1,000,000 years. Can you imagine having dinner with these guys? Would the conversation have been fun? I don't think so. And then another change comes, the Acheulean stone tool tradition, and lo and behold, they stick with that for 1,000,000 years as well. So what does this tell us? It tells us that they are passing down cultural information, but also that they're incredibly rigid in their thinking, that having got locked on a particular track, they are unable to change it. And we really don't see any sign of change, even after anatomically modern humans appear on the planet. It's long after the appearance of anatomically modern humans that suddenly a light seems to go on in the human brain all around the world. And we get the great cave art, the rock art being produced. Really, this is a story within the last 100,000 years, and really within the last 40,000 years, in terms of the cave art. Now, what is cave art all about? A lot of people will tell you, again, this is the problem with modern archaeology, that we tend to impose ourselves upon the past. We see the past as a mirror rather than a window to look through. So the idea was that the cave art must have been all to do with utilitarian purposes. They must have been somehow hoping to capture the soul of the animal that they wished to eat, and they would depict it as pierced. This notion of hunting magic is complete and utter rubbish, and it has been rejected by the facts. Only about 2% of the animals portrayed in cave art are shown to be pierced, and there is absolutely no relationship between the animals that were eaten around particular caves and the animals that are depicted in those caves. In Lascaux, for example, the primary animal depicted is not the reindeer. The reindeer, however, was the primary food element around Lascaux. There's actually only one image of a reindeer in Lascaux, and it has the feet of a duck. How do we explain that? Other elements of cave art begin to tell us the story. We again and again see images of therianthropes. That's from the Greek therion, which means wild beast, and anthropos, which means man. Creatures that are part human and part animal in form. And again, of course, the academics say, there's nothing to this. That was just them dressing up in skins because they wanted to emulate the animals. No, it's more complicated than that. Let's go to Chauvet Cave in France on the left here. And this is really an interesting image. We see Bison Man. It's got the head of a bison, but the hind legs of a human being. straddling a large female figure with a prominent pubic triangle. But oddly, the female figure has no head. Instead, her right arm is transforming into the head of a lion. So this is not somebody dressed up in skins. This is a moment of transformation or of shape-shifting, which is being witnessed here at Chauvet 32 or 33,000 years ago. And here from South Africa, from the Cedarburg, perched on a zigzag, we see humans transforming into antelopes. And here from the Drakensberg, these two human figures, it's a little bit small here, but they have the heads of antelopes. This one has two feathers growing out of his back as though he's about to transform into a bird. And around this one are wrapped two serpents, and those two serpents also have the heads of antelopes. I think it's reasonable to say that this is not an observation made from nature. This is not what you see when you're out hunting on the plains. You don't see humans transforming into antelopes or antelope-headed human beings. You don't see a woman transforming into a lion. So we have to ask ourselves, what was the inspiration for imagery like this? What led people to create this kind of imagery? And why, for example, do we have these geometric patterns, these grids here between two ibexes at Lascaux, or these flows of dots from El Castillo Cave, and an interesting sort of precursor of the Windows logo here? What's it all about? Well, this is a good moment to pay tribute to the late, great Terence McKenna and his amazing book, Food of the Gods, which anticipated so much in this field. Terence was ahead of the game in almost everything, and he was certainly ahead of the game in understanding the origins of human behavior. But there's been excellent academic work done on this, going back actually to the 1960s, where it was noted that interesting results from the use of hallucinogenic drugs to induce altered states of consciousness were registered by human volunteers. In fact, the results were so similar and so consistent that it was possible for researchers to draw up a chart of the psychedelic experience in a way which often begins with scintillating flashing lights and patterns. Then there's a sense of them taking form. Then there's the feeling of passing through some kind of vortex into a seamlessly convincing parallel reality, if you've had enough of the substance in question. And then finally we emerge into that parallel realm, and we find ourselves encountering entities who communicate with us, often telepathically. And it's interesting that this modern volunteer from the 1960s depicted an entity as follows. He's wearing a modern business suit, but he has the head of a fox. And that's really no different from Bison Man and Lion Man from the Painted Caves. It's a hint that our ancestors in the Painted Caves were having psychedelic experiences. And the really solid, detailed academic work on this has been done by Professor David Lewis-Williams at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, and the whole team at the Rock Art Research Institute there. And they call it the neuropsychological theory of cave art. And to cut a long story short, the nature of the imagery gives away the inspiration. And the inspiration was undoubtedly visionary experience. We're looking at art that was created effectively by ancient shamans who had experienced deeply altered states of consciousness and then returned to depict the visions that they had seen. This theory actually explains all of the ingredients of cave art, and it is without a doubt the most powerful and effective academic theory on this subject. David Lewis-Williams himself has never taken a psychedelic, and his principal critic, Paul Barn, has also never taken a psychedelic. So when I wrote about this, I compared it to two celibate monks discussing the joys of sex. However, David does make the point that the research is there, and he prefers to focus on the research rather than the experience. I think he's missing something, but nevertheless, he's made a great contribution to our understanding of rock and cave art. And here are some of David's books inside the Neolithic Mind. The Mind in the Cave is the go-to book. I highly recommend that you read this and understand the neuropsychological theory of cave art. So the art itself bears witness to the use of visionary substances deep in the human story, but within the last 100,000 years. It's interesting. Here's New Scientist, 6th of March 2011, trumpeting the earliest evidence for magic mushroom use in Europe, because there's a cave with images of Psilocybe hispanica within the cave. But of course, the evidence for the use of psychedelics is present in the art already long before that. So the interesting thing is that this moment when we transition to creating fully symbolic art is also regarded by archaeologists as the single most significant change in the whole story of the evolution of human behavior. We cannot say that it was caused by psychedelics. We can't say that yet. But we can say there's a strong correlation between the appearance of art that could only have resulted from psychedelic experiences and this huge leap forward in human behavior. That correlation is very clear. Was it causative? I happen to think it was, but we can't absolutely prove that. Everything takes a quantum leap forward. Hunting tactics, stone tools, spiritual ideas. Our ancestors start burying the dead with grave goods, with food, with water. You don't do that unless you have some concept of the individual continuing on after death. It's quite possible that this is when spoken languages first emerged as well. So, in the light of the evidence from the painted caves, we need to take a fresh look at ancient art from all around the world. Maybe psychedelics have played a much greater role in the story of civilization than has hitherto been admitted. So this Toltita ceramic from Ecuador, where we see the arm of the figure transforming into a serpent, is really the same kind of image as we find from Chauvet, where this woman is transforming into a lion. And Olmec art, a bird-headed figure seated on a throne, Olmec figurine with feline features, and so on and so forth. Classic therianthrope, classic entity of vision. And what was the Minotaur in the story of Theseus, if not a visionary creature, part beast, part human? And there's a bull man wrestling with a lion from Akkad in 1800 BC. These figures from Mesopotamia. And of course, all of the ancient Egyptian deities were therianthropic in form, whether it's ibis-headed Thoth, or the psychopomp Anubis, the guide of souls, jackal-headed Anubis. The Sphinx, of course, is a therianthropic monument. And this is a lovely little image here from one of the tombs of the nobles. Here we see, at Thebes, here we see the deceased looking at her own soul. The ancient Egyptians had a very complex notion of the soul. There were at least 11 different elements of it, but one was the Ba soul, the bird soul that flew free of the body after death. And there she's looking at her own soul in the form of a human-headed bird. So, given this vast background of psychedelic use and visionary experience in the human story, it's reasonable to wonder, why is our society so rabid about consciousness-altering drugs and plants? Particularly where psychedelics are concerned, what actually is it that those in power are really afraid of? And their fear causes a lot of pain to others, those of us who do wish to explore our consciousness using the gratuitous graces that nature has provided to us, face imprisonment, the ruin of our lives, the breaking down of the doors of our homes, the entry into our lives of the police state, not because we did any harm to others, but simply because we defied the prevailing ideology of our society. It's a very serious matter where a society believes that it has the right to control even the consciousness of individual members of society. This goes far beyond the issue of freedom of speech. This is the issue of freedom of consciousness, of cognitive liberty, of sovereignty over consciousness. A greatly neglected human right in Western societies today. It's not as though our societies are against altered states of consciousness as such. On the contrary, big pharmaceutical industries are licensed to make billions of dollars of profit every year from producing really ghastly consciousness-altering drugs, really bad ones. I speak from experience. I had 5 years on Prozac and Siroxat back in the 1990s, before I really got into psychedelics. And those were 5 of the most miserable years of my life. And these so-called antidepressants are, in my opinion, anti-human substances, and they numb the mind, and they numb the brain, and they numb our emotional intelligence. And they're a dreadful thing, and I don't believe that they help with depression at all. I, for the first time in my life, found myself seriously contemplating suicide under the influence of Siroxat. And that's when I knew I had to stop. And it took me the best part of a year to get off that hideous consciousness-altering drug, reducing the amount I took every day by a tiny fraction until finally I was free of it. Fortuitously, I became free of it in 2003, and just later that year was the first time I went to the Amazon and drank ayahuasca. It was just as well that I got the Siroxat out of my system, because these SSRIs do not engage well with ayahuasca. At any rate, whether it's so-called hyperactivity disorder or depression, Big Pharma is in a kind of unholy alliance with medical doctors, every year inventing new so-called mental illnesses for which new consciousness-altering drugs are prescribed to allow Big Pharma to make even more money. Deeply hypocritical situation. And then, of course, there's alcohol. Without a doubt, the most boring drug on the planet. And yet glorified and lionized in our society. Regarded as just a great way to take the edge off at the end of the day. It's an incredibly dangerous drug. It kills countless thousands of people every year. We are seeing massive liver problems in young people today, cirrhosis of the liver because of binge drinking, the traffic accidents, the violence, everything associated with alcohol, as far as I can see, is profoundly negative and really quite dangerous. And yet, our governments give free license for the drinking of alcohol, but will send us to prison for consuming a psychedelic, which is far less harmful in every way. So when our governments tell us that they are making psychedelics illegal because they're harmful, that's obviously a lie. If they really were concerned about the harms of drugs and they felt that the way to deal with them was to make them illegal, the first drug they would make illegal is alcohol. So whatever they're doing, it's not about what they say they're doing. We're incredibly diverse creatures. We have so many different states of consciousness available to us. But our society particularly values and venerates the, let's call it the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness. Now, let me be clear. I don't have anything against the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness. When I get in an airplane, I want the pilot to be in an alert, problem-solving state of consciousness. And I would like him to stay in that state of consciousness until he lands me safely at my destination. After that, what he does with his head is his own business. But while he's flying me, I want him alert and problem-solving. The problem is that it's the over-dominance of that state of consciousness in our society. We've effectively given a monopoly to the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness, and we've tended to demonize other states of consciousness unless they serve the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness. So now we can understand why alcohol is okay in our society, because it doesn't question or undermine the alert, problem-solving state of consciousness. It's seen as giving the the drones on the workforce an opportunity to relax at the end of the day so that they can be ever more efficient producers and consumers the next day. And antidepressants, they support the alert problem-solving state of consciousness as well. They keep us going to our jobs every day. But psychedelics, I think they're illegal because they lead to questioning of the established control system of society and of the states of consciousness that serve it. In that sense, they are profoundly revolutionary in their nature. Well, what I'm showing you is a piece of Gnostic art, which tells us that psychedelic mushrooms were very important to that faction of early Christianity that we now know as the Gnostics. We wouldn't know much about the Gnostics at all, actually, if it weren't for a discovery made near this temple in Upper Egypt. This is the temple of Hathor at Dendera, and at a place called Nag Hammadi, very near there, in 1945, an Egyptian farmer found a buried group of jars, pottery jars, and in those jars was an entire library of Gnostic texts. They're called the Nag Hammadi Library today. Prior to 1945, we only knew about the Gnostics from those in the mainstream Christian community who had persecuted them. After 1945, at least we have the ability to hear what the Gnostics themselves said. Gnosticism is an incredibly complex philosophy, and I just don't have time here or the inclination to go into it in great depth. But it definitely is dualistic. It sees a separation between the material and the spiritual realm. And it sees, Gnosticism does not hate the material world. This is one of the lies about Gnosticism that the persecutors spread. It's much more complicated than that, but it does see attachment to the material world, extreme attachment to the material world as negative for the progress of the soul. Now, in Gnostic cosmology, I'm just not even going to try to explain it all here. Read the Nag Hammadi Library. It's available in English. In Gnostic cosmology, there was the notion of an entity that they called the demiurge. And the demiurge isn't God. The demiurge is this puffed up minor supernatural who is extremely jealous and angry and always wants people to do horrible things. However, the Gnostic insight was that the entity that we have been taught to believe is God, whether we call him Jehovah or Yahweh or Allah or just God, that the entity that the monotheistic religions regard as God, that entity really is the demiurge. He's not God at all. There was a movie called The Usual Suspects, in which there was a famous line, the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he did not exist. The Gnostics take it a step further. The greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world that he is God. And this entity seeks to snuff out the divine spark in man, seeks to divide us from ourselves, seeks to separate us. It envies the divine spark within us. The demiurge and his archons, who are kind of evil angels disguised as human beings, seek to mislead and enslave mankind and work to prevent us from ever awakening to our true potential. They spread fear, hatred, and suspicion amongst us and drive us into all manner of reckless crime, into wars and frauds and all things hostile to the nature of the soul. Well, it's interesting when we look at the Gnostic story of the Garden of Eden. We all know the story of the Garden of Eden, right? The serpent tempts Eve to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and this is a really bad thing. From the Gnostic point of view, guess what? The serpent is the good guy. Okay? And what he's doing is he's helping Adam and Eve to escape from the clutches of the demiurge. He's saying, you must eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because if you do not have that knowledge, you cannot make informed choices. You cannot progress and grow and develop the spirits unless You make those choices. You're not simply, I'm putting this in modern language, but you're not simply meat robots, here to do the will of the demiurge. You have your own mission. And interestingly, where we see surviving Gnostic art, it depicts the tree of life as a psychedelic mushroom, Amanita muscaria, and sometimes the psilocybe as well. And there, if we look at the images of the Garden of Eden, what do we see? But the serpent is almost always depicted as a human-headed serpent. In other words, a perianthrope, in other words, a classic creature of vision. Now, of course, Adam and Eve were humiliatingly driven from the garden by the demiurge and his servants, beaten about the bottom with the flat of swords, driven out and made certain that they would never return to the Garden of Eden. From the Gnostic point of view, the reading of that story is completely different from the reading in mainstream Christianity. And likewise, with the flood, we're told in the Bible that it was inflicted to punish evil, but from the Gnostic point of view, it was inflicted to punish humanity for having risen so high, inflicted by the demiurge, and to take the light, the gnosis that was growing amongst men. The survivors were thrown into great distraction and into a life of toil, so that mankind might be occupied with worldly affairs and might not have the opportunity of being devoted to the Holy Spirit. And throughout history, those who sought the liberating gnosis, the light, knowledge of the true nature of things, have been persecuted. And we have a relatively recent example of this persecution in southwestern France in the 12th and 13th centuries. And this concerns a really remarkable people called the Cathars, who were absolutely in the chain of the Great Heresy. They were a Gnostic group that had established themselves in southwestern France in the area that we call Occitania or the Languedoc today. They created a beautiful society where men and women, can you imagine this in the deep Middle Ages? Men and women were to be regarded as absolutely equal, where the view was that universal literacy must be spread. They were inventors of paper. They sought to spread literacy everywhere as a liberating force. The troubadours, the great poets, came from the Cathars. But the Cathars had one problem. They regarded the Pope as the agent of the devil on earth. And that was a very dangerous thing to do in the 12th and 13th centuries. And as a result, the Catholic Church declared a crusade against the Gnostics. It was called the Albigensian Crusades, after the city of Albi in southwestern France. And this hideous army of harm came down out of northern France, armed with the most ghastly weapons of destruction, seething with hatred and anger, to utterly annihilate the Cathars, to destroy them completely, to wipe them from the face of the earth. Truly a demiurgic project, if ever there was one. And the Cathars were burnt at the stake. Their books were gathered up and destroyed and burnt. This was the time that the Inquisition was created. The Inquisition was first and foremost created to persecute the Cathars. It was a ghastly episode in the human story. From the Gnostic point of view, the demiurge and his archons and their human servants are always trying to see the light. And they're certainly to steal the light, and they're certainly doing so today. And if the light is growing amongst mankind today, and I believe it is, then we can be sure that tremendous archonic forces are working to suppress that light. And let's just say the Gnostics are right, okay? If they're right, then how might we expect these forces to manifest in the modern world? Well, I think this is one of the ways they manifest. Through the priests and the rabbis and the mullahs of the three great monotheistic faiths. They are the main agents of the demiurge in the world today, according to Gnosticism. Jealous intermediaries who impose themselves between us and the divine and seek to persuade us that we cannot experience the divine except through their mediation. these religions, they all talk the talk of peace and love, but they walk a very different walk. They walk the walk of fear and hatred and suspicion. It's not so long ago that witches were being burned at the stake in Europe. I know that in Britain the last burning of a witch was in the 1700s. We have ghastly scandals within the Catholic Church that are covered up in the most insidious way. And in Islam, the stoning to death of women for looking at another man, you know, that a woman can simply have her life taken away because she no longer loves her husband. This is appalling. This is a dreadful thing. So this is the walk that these religions walk, and we should not look or listen to what they say. We should only look at what they do and their consequences in the world. And the consequences of the three great monotheistic religions in the world today are, in my opinion, unutterably ghastly. And they are dividing us from one another and alienating us from our true heritage. Recently in Iraq, we have the mass murder of the minority Yazidis by members of the Islamic State. And the Yazid religion actually has its roots in ancient Gnosticism. I would say that Islamic State is an Abrahamic death cult, but it's not alone. The whole Abrahamic religion is a death cult, in my view. And then, of course, governments. They're another archonic force in the world today, which seeks to alienate us from responsibility over ourselves, which very cunningly and cleverly gathers our money in taxes and then uses it to enslave our souls and our spirits. The evolution of the so-called nanny state, the whole world of surveillance and control that we live in today, where we're constantly persuaded that we must give up rights and freedoms to ensure our security. This is an archonic project. The Gnostics would have seen it immediately as the demiurge at work to alienate us from ourselves. And what do governments do? They manipulate fear and hatred and suspicion to divide us from one another. And this is the moment where I'll say that I'm very sad that narrow nationalism and misguided views of patriotism have led the British public to withdraw from the European community. I don't like big bureaucracies, and I don't like big governments, but I do feel that the future of the human race is in integration rather than falling back onto old ways of functioning. And nationalism and patriotism, in my view, have long ago passed their sell-by date. I personally detest patriotism. Why should I feel any special loyalty to a fellow Briton just because he or she happened to be born on the same piece of land that I was?